week. Look, I'm going to be pretty short here at the top. Tennessee's got some real by-God problems, and this legislature is totally disconnected from them. Just absolutely engaged in performative nonsense. I think I voted on my third Charlie Kirk honoring bill today. We're 46th in life expectancy, and it turns out that regulating the forms that can be filled out at doctor's offices and the honorifics that students call their teachers doesn't actually improve that scenario. We have Tennesseans who are dealing with absurd lines caused by Trump's shutdown of TSA. We have Tennesseans who are rightfully alarmed and scared about what the impact of the Trump war in Iran is going to mean for our troops, but also for our economy, with rising gas prices, rising grocery prices, a destabilized economy. And it turns out that legislation that's about how we're going to refer to a river valley on another continent and how we're going to teach about communism in our high schools is just not going to do one thing to help anybody. And so I don't know, when you have a legislature that is this far disconnected from the actual problems facing Tennesseans, like that's the biggest problem we have. So with that, I'll take questions. If y'all have anything about actual stuff that came up this week.
This week you voted against a bill that had to do with IVF regulation. I wanted to get a little bit more of your thoughts on that. You were saying that this is a space that we shouldn't really be legislating in, and some fertility advocates agree with that.
So, almost everybody in Tennessee supports families' right to seek IVF treatment. And yet in Tennessee, we continue to see year after year new big efforts to overhaul the rules that apply to IVF clinics. That doesn't provide the stability for these clinics to actually know that they can safely operate in Tennessee. It doesn't provide the security that Tennessee families need to know that those clinics will be in place and have rules and be able to continue treating them over the course of their treatment. People who've gone through IVF know that it is not a one-off, one doctor visit. This is a lengthy process where families are committing, sometimes thousands of dollars in years of their lives to make sure that they can have children, which we should support and not make harder. And so I think just, this constant legislation around this after Dobbs and the sort of Republican assault on religious freedom, I think it's devastating to families in the real world.
Yep. You spoke about the pride flag ban right before it died. I'm just going to ask you, do you think what you said had an impact on your colleagues, or did you know that was going to go down?
I wasn't sure how it was going to go down. I think you always hope that what you say in a committee will have an effect. I think I want to give credit to some of what my Republican colleagues said, who actually stood up for real principles there. And look, we're going way too far in so much of the legislation here, trying to push a hard right ideological agenda, and that is not what people want. Now, people don't want leftist indoctrination in school or right-wing indoctrination in school. They just don't want indoctrination. And I think that I was really glad that we were able to put together a majority to stand against that, what I consider to be pretty hateful legislation that would have barred people from just having outward signs of celebrating pride in their schools or in their offices or volunteering in their communities. I think that bill was wrong. I was glad we stopped it.
There was some commotion in the House about a bill that offers health care to people detransitioning and also creates some data reporting around people who access gender affirming services that passed in the House. Do you see that advancing in the Senate?
Yes, I think that legislation is moving in the Senate as well. And first, that's not the only piece of legislation this year that has to do with compiling lists of people who are unpopular for the government. And I may have said this recently, but historically, it does not go well when we collect lists of people who are unpopular at a given time. Like, that is, like, the data collection usually leads to bad outcomes. Well, there were collections of Japanese Americans prior to internment. And then without going into like what happened with lists of people in Vichy, France, or in other times in our history, nobody ends up being proud when lists like that start getting created, and more importantly, when they start getting used. But there's also just some silliness in this. I mean, some of that legislation is just is going to expose us to even more legal problems and more litigation from the state, and continue distracting us from actually making a difference in people's actual lives.
The bill about basically turning our schools into ICE informants. Hamilton County principals came out this week against Bo Watson's bill. I didn't see what happened in the Senate. There was a rumor that he was just gonna move it to the desk or something. What happened with that bill, and do you think?
So for the second week in a row, that bill was on the Senate calendar, and when its time came up, it was moved back to the calendar committee. I mean, that doesn't mean it's officially dead necessarily, but I think what it shows is that the pushback that representatives and senators are receiving from school districts, teachers, principals, citizens across the state is actually having an influence, as it should. I mean, that legislation the purpose of that legislation is to relitigate a Supreme Court fight from 40 years ago. People really want us to focus on educating their kids for 40 years from now, not relitigating these past immigration fights. And so, and I think there's a huge unfunded mandate there. There's a cruelty. Like, we just know, like, most people know that it's wrong to punish kids for the problems of adults in the system. And so I hope that legislation does not return this year, and I thought it was a good sign that it got sent back to calendar.
And a lot of these bills that we've been talking about don't really get at affordability concerns that citizens might have. I know there's multiple different bills that are sort of looking to chip away at the grocery tax. Is there hope for any of those?
Well, I mean, I think it's a long road ahead for any of the bills that would go with the grocery tax. I have several pieces of legislation. There are numerous members that have legislation that would reduce the grocery tax. None of those were funded in the governor's budget. And so, it's not impossible, but it's a much harder lift for anything to be done on that front right now. But to your broader point, I think we're trying to pass initiatives aimed at affordability wherever we can, but the agenda that's being set, that the work of this legislature is focused on culture. It is not focused on making it easier for families to make a living and to get by on their paycheck. And we're living at a time when I think Reverend Love certainly knows this from both his constituents and his congregants, that, people are really legitimately struggling out there, and they need help, and they don't need yet another, we don't need a new Charlie Kirk holiday or, some of this other sort of performative stuff. They need actual legislation that's gonna make a difference in their lives. Other questions? Representative Love has around, and I don't know if you have anything that you
Would you like to wax philosophical?
acknowledge this week?
No, I do think, and I do have a concern mentioning grocery tax. There's a bill that came out of finance this past week that would allow metropolitan forms of government to enact a reduction on grocery tax if they choose to. My main concern is that that bill is attached to the Metro Council size reduction. And I'm trying to figure out what the aim is. Are they trying to take the year out of it that's required to start the reduction, to try to get around to the objection to it? So we need to look at that piece of legislation. Should be coming through calendar next week. So that's one of the concerns I have about the grocery tax.
On that note, there was an article in the Lookout about there's some sort of new state committee that's going to oversee how tourism dollars get spent. I think somebody skeptical might see it as more state overreach and taking away from Nashville. Is that how you guys see it?
I think if you go back at least 2 years, what you'll find is much of this started when there were questions raised about the money that was used by the city of Nashville to provide more protection downtown for persons who were tourists and residents of Nashville. The convention center, I believe, had revenue that exceeded what their expenditures were, and the city of Nashville, in conversation with them, chose to use some of those dollars to provide extra security for people downtown, protect the residents and also the tourists. And so that was, I think, the start of it. And so now what you see is, I think with the state of Tennessee having in excess of $30 billion in tourism every year, Nashville contributing 13+ billion of that. I think we see members now who are seeing some funds that they want to make sure they know where it's directed to. I think that's one thing we need to be watching for, to make sure that it's not a total removal of Nashville's influence in those dollars that are used primarily, again, not just to provide the engine for the state budget in Tennessee, but also to take care of some things in Nashville. You must remember, when people come to any city to visit the sites that are there, that causes extra traffic on the roads, which means that it's gonna degrade those roads, it's gonna cause extra traffic in those hotel rooms and in those shops. Yes, you benefit from those tourist dollars, but it's infrastructure that has to be maintained. And so part of the responsibility, I think, with those dollars is used to maintain those areas, to maintain the safety and the comfort of the residents of those places.
So there are a couple different pieces of legislation that would be regulating sort of tourism dollars or tourist development zones. And I mean, I think one premise that just is really problematic here is that, you know, the notion that the state needs to come in and intervene. I mean, there's been a partnership, of course, but Nashville is the entity that actually put forward the dollars and investment and took on the risk to actually make this work. And so now that it's been successful, it turns out that there's a lot of seats at the table. I mean, I think if this had not been successful, Nashville would be, taxpayers would be responsible for dealing with the loss. But since it's you know, mainly upside, we're seeing now there's a huge need to be part of how we govern the reward. And that I think is just inherently wrong. And then frankly, the success that we've seen here over the last 20 years disproves the notion that local governments aren't capable of managing these areas. There's one really problematic piece of legislation that would frankly turn these tourist development zones, not just in Nashville, in Gatlinburg, Pigeon Forge, Knoxville, Chattanooga, Memphis, into effectively occupied territory, where you know, the highway patrol's responsible for the ordinary prosecution of crimes, where the ordinances and laws that get passed by the local elected officials get displaced by rules that get written by, you know, unaccountable bureaucrats in some Tennessee office of the Department of Tourist Development. I mean, like, there's some of this is just kind of nonsense. And, you know, we're not seeing enough focus on outcomes, we're seeing a focus on power, right? And so much, frankly, if you actually look behind you don't even have to read between the lines, if you just read the lines on the page, a significant part of the legislation we're passing this year is just increasing the power of the state and increasing the power of companies. And so, I mean, we passed legislation this past week that gives any company the legal right to go to court and get a declaration that says they are a zero emissions company, as long as that company's emissions are less than 10% of the aggregate of China and India combined. And so, like, the biggest polluter in America doesn't meet that measure. But so the biggest polluter in America now has a right to come to a Tennessee court and be declared a zero emissions provider? Like, that's just absurd. And that's the kind of thing that's done just to try to shift power away from consumers and onto like the wealthiest companies in the world who are really profiting now that gas prices are over, $150 or over $100 a barrel. And so, I mean, we see that, then we also see all these places where they're trying to make sure that citizens and can't get relief when the government screws them over, right? Like, school systems can't bring lawsuits against the state, even if the state's breaking its own laws. And so, like, when people don't want the laws to be enforced, that's a good sign that things are going in the wrong direction. We see it week in and week out around here.
Anybody else? Thanks, y'all.
Thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.